I have been meaning to talk with you for several weeks about the interesting structure of the book of Genesis. And it is seen in the repetition of this Hebrew word, toledoth, which is typically translated generations. The first is chapter 2, verse 4. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth. And it seems as though what we're talking about is what follows. And that's why I've drawn this arrow this way. So you go from the heavens and the earth to Jacob in the story of the book. And so you begin with Adam, 5:1, Noah, 6:9. Then the three sons of Noah, and that's why I've drawn the arrow here, Ham and Japheth. And Shem is the one you're continuing on with, as we see in 11:10. Then a descendant of Shem, Terah. Let's see here. I think I've left one out. Abraham, yeah. There's no, in fact, Abraham is not mentioned. And it's interesting that in two more of these cases, we have the generations of Isaac. It's really about Jacob. And we have the generations of Jacob, and what follows is really about Joseph. So it's interesting that in all three of these cases, you have this interesting story. So here again, and I don't know the reason why, commentators have a number of suggestions. Why are these offshoots mentioned? And especially Esau. Esau at great length. But the storyline is clearly from the earth to Adam, to Noah, to Shem, to Abraham, to Jacob, and to Joseph. So you're moving all the way down through from the earth to a family. And that's the way the book is laid out with, as I say, these interesting, here's the generations of Terah, but it's really about Abraham. Here are the generations of Isaac, but it's really about Jacob. Here are the generations of Jacob, but it's really about Joseph. Questions or comments there? Marvin, you're grinning.
You're awfully close to Cincinnati.
Yes. So as we think about the book, that's what's happening, is this focusing right down to the family. And that is going to take us straight into Exodus then. What about this family? What happens to them? We've talked about, I mentioned early on, that chapters 1 through 11 give us the problem. The problem is God designed the world for blessing. But instead, we have brought curse upon ourselves. And part of what we're going to talk about in regard to the flood relates to this whole issue. How are we going to solve this problem of the curse which has fallen upon the human race and upon creation as a result of our failure? Well, in fact, it won't be through the flood. We're going to have to solve it some other way. And here we're dealing in pretty large generalities. The world, the violence that has come upon the world, the tragedy that has befallen the world. The solution we're going to do, so here you're dealing with the whole world. Here, you're dealing with 3 generations of one family. And later on, sometime around Christmas, I suspect, we'll want to talk about the significance of this. How is the world to be saved?
Generation, talk about genealogy, it's about life story.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. We're not talking so much genealogy. Now, in some cases, especially the Esau chapters, is pretty much, and it's interesting, it's pretty much Ishmael. All you get is names, generations. But yes, in general, we're talking not about genealogies, we're talking about life story. And it is in the life story that God is touching the world. Okay, we have a few questions remaining over from last week. Those of you who came today, I'm sorry you don't have that sheet with you. But if you do have the green sheet, it's odd, I think, if you look at chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. God speaks very, very explicitly. No ifs, no ands, no buts. He says that I have determined, this is verse 13, I have determined to make an end to all flesh. Bingo. For the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So, make yourself an ark of gopher. What? He said just now he was going to destroy. Well, I think that includes Noah. Since I'm going to do this, so make. What's going on here? How do you explain this? Is he going to destroy all the earth or not? Pauline? Okay. I think that's a fair implication from the rest of the story. But as far as this is concerned, this is going to be significant. When we say all, we're talking quantitatively. When Hebrew uses all, it's speaking qualitatively. This one says every last one. This one says the whole bunch. And this relates, as I've said to you before, about the way they use numbers. They don't use numbers the same way we do with the kind of specificity that we do. And this is where God has done this to us. He has given us a word for everybody, everywhere, in every culture, in all times, but he's done it in the particular linguistic culture of a single people. And that's where so much misinterpretation of the Bible has arisen, is that we interpret it according to our linguistic and cultural standards instead of their linguistic and cultural standards. So this is an example here where we don't mean every last one. We mean a whole bunch. And one escapes. So my question goes on, what does this statement, I'm going to destroy all, so build an ark, say about God's justice and God's grace? They can coincide. They can go together. In the midst of punishing all the wicked of the earth. There is grace for one who has not performed perfectly. Remember, the King James says he was perfect in all his ways. And I had a former student write me a couple of weeks ago and say, well, if he was perfect, he didn't need grace. He was not perfect in his performance, and he needed grace. He was perfect in his heart toward God, and therefore was deserving of grace. Again, this is, I think, important for us to try to think our way through here. Okay, so God says, I'm going to destroy all, so build an ark. I'm going to find a way to preserve the human race while I destroy the human race. I'm going to treat the human race as it deserves, but I'm also going to find a way to graciously preserve the human race. That's our God. Sure it is. Sure it is. Yes.
You can deal with that.
Yes.
And still come up.
Yes.
With a person.
Yep. With a redeemed person. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 This also relates to, I've talked about it a lot. The sacrificial system is given for unintentional sin. It is not given for the person who says, I'm going to live like hell and then I'll give a sacrifice and God will have to forgive me. And God says, good luck with that. No, it's given for the person who says, I desperately want to live for God. I intend in my heart to be wholly His. But I know that my performance will fall short of your absolute perfection. So, because my heart is pure, my life is going to be 97%. Wow. There's a problem with that. The only passing grade is 100%. If you're going to get to heaven on your own works, it's got to be 100%. So God has made a way for the person. Now, well, I better finish that sentence. God has made a way for the person who is determined to live for Him, come what may. God has made a way. Now, are there sacrifices for those who have said, I don't care what you want. I'm going to do what I want. Are there sacrifices for that person? Yes. And I've quoted it before to you, but it's Psalm 51. A crushed and a broken heart is the sacrifice. David says, you don't want goats. You don't want sheep. But there is a sacrifice. Yes, there is. But the sacrificial system is not designed for that. You can't just go to church and it'll all be okay. Mm-mm. Well, I better leave that. Any comments you want to make here? You hear me? Am I crazy? Yes, but anyway, am I wrong? Yeah? 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 Good point. They didn't have faith. They weren't willing to trust God for their survival. Yeah? Okay. Verse 18 of chapter 6. Here is the first mention of covenant in the Bible. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. we've talked a little bit before about what is called dispensational theology. This was basically constructed in the middle of the 19th century by a man named Darby in England, a Plymouth Brethren connection. And he said, clearly, God worked in different ways in different times. He eventually developed 7 different dispensations. The Scofield Bible was perhaps the most popular spreader of this theology. And the idea is that, so for instance, during the Hebrew period, the Hebrew dispensation, they were saved by law. Now, in the church dispensation, we are saved by grace. And then there will be the end time dispensation. And in the end time dispensation, both of those will be true. The temple will be rebuilt so that the Hebrews can offer their sacrifices, recognizing that that's to Christ or of Christ. But that's why, for instance, the temple has to be rebuilt. There's no ifs, ands, or buts there, according to this theology. And we are told that there is a warehouse in Indiana with Indiana limestone stored up to build the temple, which surprises me a little bit, since Israel is all limestone. Why we have to fly some from Bedford, Indiana, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, so this system where God works in that way then, finish that one, God works in this way now. This, of course, this was the dispensation of law. This is the dispensation of spirit, and so forth. Well, there was a reaction against that. And the reaction was, no, it's not dispensations, it's covenants. And these covenants are not distinct like this. In fact, God works in essence in the very same way all the way through. And if law is prominent here, it is law which is an expression of God's grace. And if grace is prominent here, it is as an expression of his law. This is covenant theology. And again, this can be quite developed. So you have the Adamic covenant, supposedly. I'll say something about that in a moment. That God started out with a covenant given to the world. And it was the covenant between God and Adam. If you will do what you're supposed to do, if you will care for the garden, if you will be my agent on earth, then, well, they broke that covenant. So God makes a new covenant, the Noachic covenant. Excuse me, I shouldn't say that way. God reaffirms this covenant. And I'll say more why. The Noachic covenant, the Sinai covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. Basically 5: Adamic, Noachic, Sinaitic, Davidic, and the new covenant. My dear friend, Dr. Daniel Block, has written a very large theology of the Bible in which he illustrates this beautifully. But I have to say, I think he's wrong. He thinks I'm wrong with some things too, but anyway. Covenant is not the way the world is meant to operate. Covenant is about redemption. Covenant has come in to deal with the fact of sin. It's because of chapter 3 that we now have to have covenants. The word covenant doesn't appear before this place in chapter 6. And the interesting thing about this covenant, and let's talk about it. What is God going to do? What? Right, he's going to preserve them. Why is he going to do that? And grace. They have done nothing to deserve this deliverance. As a result of God's punishment of sin, God in grace offers to preserve them. Now, what does Noah have to do? He has to obey. How does he obey according to the verse? He has to build a boat and do what? Animals, animals, animals. Interesting. Why doesn't he take fish in? They can swim in the flood. The flood will not kill them. What doesn't God want to happen? He doesn't want animals to be destroyed in the judgment that is going to come on the human race. Now, you can't very well keep the animals alive and flood the human race. Everything that has breath of life in it, as the text says. By the way, lest I forget, here is a prayer guide for Africa. And we've been asked to make these available. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put it right over here on the music stand. And please help yourself to those at the end of the class. So in many ways, this covenant, let's turn over to chapter 9, verse 8. This covenant gets expanded here. God said to Noah and to his sons, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature that's with you, the birds, the livestock, every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It's for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." What does Noah have to do to get this covenant? Nothing. Nothing.
People talk about 7 Noah nights. What is that?
They're taking this apart and finding 7 pieces in it. Do this, do this, do this, take these kinds of animals. And ultimately, where they're coming down to is what we're going to talk about in a minute, the 7 kinds of clean animals. So that's where they get the 7 and then work backward to splitting up all these details. So ultimately, the covenant as expanded in chapter 9 is unilateral. People don't have to do anything. God simply says, I'm never going to do that again. And I swear it. I make a covenant. So here we have the introduction to God's salvation plan. The world is a mess. The world is filled with violence. And God says, I'm going to preserve one person. And having preserved that one person, I'm never going to destroy the world that way again. We'll talk about covenant all the way through our study of Genesis because it's going to become more and more significant. Yes? Okay, that's what's going to come next. In terms of, the interesting thing is that the word covenant is never applied to Abraham. Excuse me, I need to back off with that. Yes, it does. Thank you. You've made a good point there. Abraham comes in chapter 15 of Genesis, and we will talk about that. Thank you. Thank you for raising that. What's happening there is we're getting a little more. There's a little something that Abraham has to do to receive this covenant. And it's going in Sinai. There's a lot you have to do to receive the covenant. God is very clearly working economically in order to bring people to where he's trying to teach them about his character and his nature. Yes, yes. Nobody in the Bible, I've said this before, I'll say it again, nobody in the Bible is ever saved by performance. From end to end, people are saved by grace. Pure, unadulterated grace, which is received by faith. Okay, I want to look at one more issue here in chapter 6 and then into chapter 7. How many pairs of animals is he to take into the ark according to verse 20 of chapter 6? One pair, 2 of every sort. Now look at 7:2. 7 pairs. How do you explain the difference? Take 2 pairs of all. Oh, by the way, take 7. Clean and unclean. Yeah.
Pairs with the 7 clean ones with the sacrifice.
Okay. Yes, what appears to be the case is he says take 2 pairs of all. Excuse me, yes, sorry. 2, yeah, 1. But incidentally, in addition, there's 1 pair of the all, and there is 7 of the clean. But there's something else that we need to look at here. What's the title for deity in verses 9 through 22? It's God, isn't it? Everywhere. What's the term for deity in 7, 1 through 5? I'm not going to spend long here, but I need to introduce you to, someone said before, this is a seminary class. Well, okay, you got a seminary teacher, you're stuck. This is Elohim. This is in German. Beginning in the late 1700s in Europe, it began to be argued that the Pentateuch was originally in 4 different documents. One used Elohim exclusively. This was written sometime after Solomon. Excuse me, get this wrong. The first one was the J, and it was written about 900. And it was written in, interestingly, Judah. And this one was written in Ephraim. Oh, that's neat, isn't it? And it was written about 800. So this was written in the south. This was written in the north. And after the destruction of the northern kingdom, these two, which were mainly just stories, were put together. And it'll be argued that's what's going on here. In the J document, you bring in 7, and 1. The Yahweh document. In the E document, it was, and we have put the two together. That's what you will be taught in almost all the seminaries in the United States today. There are about 6 that this won't be taught. So how are we going to explain this? Well, that idea of cut and paste, that doesn't make much sense at all. And then, by the way, you get the Deuteronomy, which was written in 621. And then you get the P document, the priestly document, which covers all the laws, and that's written after the return from exile. And so the Pentateuch is JEDP. Well, we know now nobody wrote ancient documents like that. That's not the way they did things in cutting apart and pasting. Okay, if we, and you know, when I teach this, it takes 4 weeks, but anyway. There's a better solution. And that is the solution that you use God when you're talking generally about his actions. And you use Yahweh or the Lord. We've talked before about what happened there. When you're talking about him in his personal redemptive character. So what's going on here? Broadly speaking, yes, you're to bring one pair of all the animals. Don't miss it. One pair. In addition, as Yahweh, the Redeemer, he says, bring 7. 7 pairs of clean by which a sacrifice can be offered. So that really is, and this is much more typical of folk literature, that you do that kind of repetition. You say it, and then you say it again in a slightly different way. So that we don't need to do this document stuff at all to understand how these kinds of variations can come in. As you read your Bible, check that out. It works remarkably well that when you're talking about God in general terms, God is the term used. When you're talking about him in more personal terms, you're talking about Yahweh. I want to point out one other thing. In chapter 7, look at verse 18. Excuse me, 16. 7:16. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in, what? What does it say? And what's the next sentence? The Lord shut the door. I think that's a very clear illustration of this point. He did what God commanded, and the Lord shut the door. As the personal redeeming God, he closes the door. So I think, again, you say, I didn't want to know any of this. If we're going to read our Bibles seriously, we better be enabled to read them seriously. So I suggest this is what's going on. We're not dealing with 2 different documents here that have been pasted together. We're dealing with folk literature, which loves repetition, and in the repetition, expansion, development, and also dealing with the personal God. Okay. I think that's everything I wanted to say there. Questions or comments before we move on? Okay. Looking at the yellow sheet. Look at the background a moment. We don't know how long it took to build the ark. If you have been to the ark encounter and looked at that thing, you know he didn't do it in 2 days. Without power lifts and without cranes, it was a long time. Traditionally, it was 100 years, but that's not specified. It's simply, he was 500 when Ham, Shem, and Japheth were born, and in his 601st year, they went in the ark. So that's a tradition. The date and the extent of the flood is a very, very complex and emotion-laden argument. What we can say is We're told that they lived eastward from Eden. If Eden was located up here somewhere, big guess. Here's the Persian Gulf down here. Presumably, they started somewhere in this area, and they ended up here. Now, as I say, Mount Ararat is 17,000 feet tall. They probably did not end up on the top of that mountain. But what the text says, they ended up in the mountains of Ararat. We talked last week about the suggestion that the ark has been found about 12 to 16 miles southeast of Mount Ararat. But the question is, once again, this word was all the earth covered by water? If so, I think we have to say it was a long time ago. It wasn't 4000 AD. BC, thank you very much. Yeah, for sure not AD. That one I'm very sure about. But about 10 to 12,000 years ago, when most of the northern hemisphere was covered with ice, it rather suddenly disappeared. Wonder what happened. Notice that the text says the fountains of the deep and the where am I looking at? The windows of heaven. Yeah. What you're talking about here, remember the deep in Genesis 1? The Spirit soared over the deep, and the deep was confined, and the dry land appeared. What we're talking about is discreation. We're going back to the beginning. Now, all of that is to make a theological point. A point about the nature of humanity, about the nature of sin. So that if we are to think that perhaps there is a great convulsion, and again, interesting suggestions have been made. Why is the earth 23 degrees off vertical? We don't know of any other heavenly orb that is like that. Suggestion is we were sideswiped. Again, you can make all kinds of suggestions here, but the point is we're talking about what the Bible wants us to believe is a historic event. If we are to think of a local flood, then I think we've got to say all humans are living in this area. If there were other hominids, who knows about them? But all humans, all into whom God had breathed the breath of life, except Noah, are in this area and were destroyed. My personal guess, and I'm eager to get to heaven and find out how wrong I am, my personal guess is that we're talking about a localized flood that occurred somewhere around 11,000 BC. And flooded this entire valley and wiped out all the humans living there. Now, yes.
failed us. Because if that's where humans were, God told Noah to build your ark for 200 years. The only thing he had to do was walk out of the mountain. And you know, if you look all over the earth, a lot of the high mountains that are existent, the top of it, not ever, particular, others. They have aqueous fossil limestone on top. Means it was flooded.
About other cultures that have story of flood.
Well, I think you're talking about the dispersal of humans around the world. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that my idea is right and that there's no other that's possible. All I want to say to you is this is not a legend. It is not a myth. It is referring to a historic event. How we explain that history, and I've talked about this before, and I'll talk about it again as long as you let me. The Bible is not a history book. Its purpose is not to tell us history. Its purpose is to tell us theology. However, that theology is taught to us through historic events. In which God acts. It only gives us enough historic information to confirm to us, yes, this did happen. This did take place. Because that's not its main concern. Its main concern is the theology. Now, the danger is that we say, oh, yes, the main purpose is theology, therefore this stuff is all legendary. No. If God didn't act in such historic events, number one, why did the Hebrews make it up? And number two, why do we believe what they claim their history taught them? So I want to say again and again, does the historicity of the Bible matter? It absolutely does. But typically, as here, it doesn't give us enough information to confidently reconstruct exactly what happened. God isn't concerned with that. God is concerned to say, this happened. And because this happened, this is what you can know about God. So these two cannot be disconnected. And that's really where a lot of the battle is today in Christian theology. Because many people will say, oh yes, they can be disconnected. If we figure out there never was a flood, it doesn't matter. And I want to say to you, I think the Bible says it matters all over the place. And what we talked about last time, the difference between the Sumerian myth and the biblical account. If the Hebrews are historicizing that myth, trying to make it look historical when it really wasn't, we're in big trouble. Kevin.
You know, Jesus said in the New Testament, days of Noah, preaching has very historic.
Yep. So this is the critical issue. And I realize this is fairly abstruse, but it's terribly important. Is the Bible historically reliable? Yes. If it isn't, we ought not to be here. We ought to be somewhere burning out our minds with drugs. But having said that, its primary purpose is not to give us history. Its primary purpose is to tell us who God is and who we are and how we need to relate to him. Okay. Thank you.